Hey everyone, my name is Victoria. Thank you for virtually coming to watch my presentation. So I decided to look at sexual trauma in women facing homelessness. A little bit of background about me. In my undergrad degree, I interned at a 24-hour women's drop-in center where I worked alongside folks who identify as women who were experiencing both chronic and episodic homelessness. And during this time, I began to hear very similar narratives regarding sexual trauma and sexual abuse within this population. So I decided to further my own knowledge by creating this presentation. And I also think it needs a lot more social awareness and social initiatives. So I decided to see what would be effective for this presentation. So to best understand sexual trauma in women facing homelessness, I think having a foundational knowledge of the problem is of course really important. So sexual trauma may mean something a little different to each person. However, for this assignment, I'm looking at it from the perspective of RAIN, which is a national anti-sexual violence organization, and they use sexual violence as an all-encompassing term. That includes all experiences of sexual assault, rape, sexual abuse, non-consensual sexual contact. And I just want to say that even though coercion and harassment aren't in RAIN's definition, I think it's important to add to this conversation as well. So sexual trauma is the exposure to any sexually abusive behavior which is unbearable or intolerable. So when I was trying to find recent statistics about sexual trauma in women facing homelessness, many reports that I did find, such as the one listed on the slide, demonstrated extremely high prevalence rates and discuss how homeless women are highly susceptible to victimization. As seen in the slide, one study found that 56% of homeless women will be raped in their lifetime, and homeless individuals are at far greater risk of sexual assault than the general population. However, I don't want to base the severity of the issue on solely statistics, as we know the complexities as to why women choose not to report instances of sexual abuse, factors of victim blaming, fear of safety, humiliation, patriarchal standards and structures, sexism, they all play a massive role into why these numbers won't be accurate. But for clinicians who have worked in the sector, I think we can all attest to the disproportionately high levels of sexual-based targetization against vulnerable women, especially folks who experience homelessness. But of course, that's not to say that other identities and genders are also not affected by this issue. So while I'm presenting on this topic, I think that's a great time for me to amplify the voices of folks who have lived experiences, who are open to sharing their perspectives of the problem. So I put in a YouTube video that we can review to see the reality.
The East Village can be one of the most dangerous neighborhoods for women in San Diego, especially those who are homeless. At New at 5:30, one group says the violence they're seeing can be helped, and they're calling on law enforcement and local leaders to do something. Well, many people ride the trolley to get somewhere. Others get on board to simply stay safe.
I started to get on the trolley at night and ride the trolley until it would end at 4 a.m. or whatever time the trolley would end. And then I would get off the trolley and literally walk the city until sunrise.
Emmy McClarty, who's been homeless off and on for the past few years, says she would stay up all night, terrified to go to sleep for fear of becoming a victim of sexual assault. She stood alongside dozens of others Monday during a rally in the East Village, calling attention to the problem.
Shine a light on how vulnerable homeless and unsheltered women and girls are to rape and sexual assault and to other violence.
This string of signs, a visual representation of the violence they say is happening on a regular basis.
29 reports of sexual assault within a half mile of here, which encompasses East Village, just in the last 6 months.
Organizers say homeless women need more safe places to seek shelter here in San Diego. They'd also like to see more opportunities for permanent housing, which McClarty says are hard to come by.
You need to have resources that actually work. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see resources that work.
All right, so while this is in San Diego, I still think it represents the problem and the measures women are forced to face with to protect themselves.
The East Village can
All right, so to further understand the realities of sexual trauma, looking at multifaceted systems of oppression need to be considered. So looking at who is most at risk due to their social location. So in one study, this topic was explored and suggested that homelessness is both gendered and racialized, and how women of color are the most impoverished citizens of the United States. In research, there are multiple supporting arguments stating that homeless women are more vulnerable to physical and sexual assault. And since racial minorities are discriminatorily impacted by homelessness, we as clinicians can assume racialized folks experiencing homelessness are the best likely to experience sexual violence than those of the general population. And just to explain again why race is implicated in this topic, one study conducted in New York and Pennsylvania looking at the homeless population found that 92.9% were African American. And also looking at cultural considerations and healing is also really important to consider. One study I read it discussed how homeless women who have been sexually assaulted often lack access to legal, medical, and mental health services. But not only is this race and gender issue, women who are a part of the LGBTQIA+ community and women living with disabilities, they also face additional barriers to services, which I think is really important to add in this conversation. So not only is the risk of experiencing sexual trauma and homelessness an issue, but adding barriers to healing from this amplifies why we need to fight for change. All right, so I wanted to break down the risk factors of sexual violence in women experiencing homelessness to better understand how this can develop into sexual trauma. So a few of the risk factors of sexual violence include unwanted pregnancies, isolation, sexually transmitted infections, HIV, hepatitis, drug or alcohol dependencies to cope, sleep disturbances, malnutrition, of course, mental health challenges, which I'll explore a little bit later on. So you can see how these experiences of sexual violence can develop into maladaptive coping strategies if someone does not have the access to heal from these experiences, which may lead to untreated trauma and mental illnesses. One organization found that 47% of homeless women meet the criteria for a major depressive disorder alone, which is twice the rate of women of the general population. So as we know, sexual trauma is a strong risk factor for a multitude of physical and psychosocial challenges. Risk factors include shock, fear, anxiety, social withdrawal, confusion. Survivors may also experience some PTSD or other stressor-related disorders and symptoms such as emotional detachment, dissociative reactions, sleep disturbances, intense psychological distress, and intrusive, distressing memories, just to name a few. And I think it's important to keep in mind that just like any other trauma experiences, symptom levels can persist for years after the sexual violence occurred or multiple sexual violence incidents occurred. And a quote I found interesting in one study stated that there is a risk that the chronic trauma of homelessness will exacerbate or entrench women's existing trauma-related difficulties. So not only is experiencing homelessness a potential trauma, but having to potentially be challenged with this sexual trauma may lead to unimaginable distress for this population. So I wanted to watch this presentation to look at how this is not just an individual or communal-based problem. It's more of a systemic problem. And I, again, want to amplify the voices of
solve the growing homeless problem in our area.
That's right. At the same time, point 6 in our news partners at the Portland Tribune, taking a look at the rising rate of sexual assaults among homeless women. Carla Castano is digging deeper into that issue.
Talking to homeless women today, it didn't take long for me to find rape victims. In fact, 2 of the 3 women that I approached said that it had happened to them and that it isn't uncommon on Portland streets.
If you don't want to have anybody see you cry, because he knows he conquered you.
Living on the street in Portland, Tessa Anderson Hewitt tells me she learned how to cry without making any noise. She says she ran away from home after being sexually abused by her older brother, but on the streets just came more of the same.
I'd be so cold to where I'd be shaking. And you know how you sit there and think, yes, okay, holler, help, help.
While Tessa's story is tragic, it's a typical scenario at transition projects.
The horrifying part of this is that women are being assaulted on the streets, but they're also victims of sexual assault as children and throughout their lives, and that's how they end up on the streets to begin with. Many of them.
I also learned many of the rapists continue to walk the streets, getting away with the crimes.
Because they're not going to report it, because they don't feel worthy of being reported, and because they're not going to be believed. It's this cycle that continues.
Do police not believe them when they report it?
It's not only the police, it's a systemic issue because we don't believe them what they say to begin with.
In downtown Portland, Carla Castano, Point 6 News.
All right, so I think this video does really speak to the systemic issue and the societal norms that support male superiority and sexual entitlement, which then put women in an even more vulnerable position and most likely have internalized disregard societal structures have about women's autonomy and women's health. And I'll explore that a little bit more when looking at the macro issues, but at least learning about the complexities of the issue and the need to act upon ways in which we need change.
Solve the growing homeless.
So now let's turn our focus into some protective factors. So even though this is a problem on the global perspective, there are so many who have dedicated their careers to helping change what is going on. So these include trauma-informed services, shelters for abused women and children, sexual assault hotlines, folks in the educational system attempting to spread awareness, those who are dedicated to helping create safe and effective paths for women. And one I just want to mention in Naples is called the Shelter for Abused Women and Children. And they have a hotline in the shelter that I shared on the slide. And they also have a list of free programs on their website for participants to further their understanding of this problem. So I encourage you to check it out if you can. Also organizations fighting for equal employment, such as the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who is responsible for enforcing laws, federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against an employee or a job, would be really impactful for women, especially in this sector, so they're not forced into unsafe methods to make an income that may result in sexual violence and sexual trauma. And there's also been different housing strategies and initiatives to prevent homelessness, such as Housing First, and case managers who are dedicated to listening to the needs of clients and trying to accommodate to the best of their abilities despite financial constraints and limitations. So to address the issue on the macro level, in my opinion, we can't isolate homelessness or sexual trauma independently since they are so heavily interconnected. We as a society need to implement measures addressing both sexual trauma and homelessness simultaneously to see change. So today, the Housing First approach has been utilized in an attempt to end homelessness. This approach has been designed to get people off of the street as the primary concern and looking at some other factors going on in the person's life afterwards, after they have a safe environment. One report I saw that looked at women being more susceptible to experiencing sexual abuse on the street, thus having a safe environment would likely decrease the incidence of sexual trauma. And just like the woman we saw in the video, women wouldn't have to be forced into taking drastic measures, such as riding public transit or walking around just because they're too scared to sleep at night in fear of getting sexually assaulted. In terms of laws, as of March 17, 2021, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, was reauthorized. which creates and supports comprehensive, cost-effective response to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, which is great. This helps with funding for various programs such as safe housing, education, prevention programs, and economic help for survivors, which is amazing. And there also are some initiatives for professionals like folks in law enforcement and learning how to speak with survivors of sexual trauma and sexual abuse. One of them is called Trauma-Informed Victim Protocol, and they're trained not to victim blame, not to minimize any experiences, and not to depower individuals. So now let's look at the effectiveness. So looking at the effectiveness of the Housing First approach, 75% to 91% of households remain housed after a year of being rapidly rehoused, thus getting women off the streets and into a safe environment would presumably decrease the incidence of sexual violence, like I spoke about. But of course, the wait list is still long. Some of them are still years long. So there definitely is improvements needed for access. While looking at the effectiveness of VAWA, it has been seen to be very cost efficient. It helps with the creation of new criminal offenses and penalties to protect women. It also increases sentences for repeat offenders. However, there are still areas where they could improve, like creating more programs and assistance for rural areas, having more data on the severity of the issue. So women's voices aren't being left out, I think is really important. And of course, funding in the sector is really important. In terms of educating professionals, I think this is an area that still needs extensive improvements. From my own experience working with this population, from hearing the experience of the women in the video, I think we can all attest for the need to improve in this area because women are still too scared to reach out. I would say that, listening to some of the experiences of the justice system, of health clinics, I think we all could change in the right direction. I think there's definitely room for some improvement. However, I don't want to, discredit the hard work that organizations have done to help combat this issue. I think these are great strides, but we just need some more assistance. So from what we saw in the video, professionals in the helping fields need to have a really good understanding of how to assess and engage with clients who have been victims of sexual violence and who are facing sexual trauma. So to work from a trauma-informed lens, learning how to conduct yourself in the initial assessment is crucial, as it can dictate whether a client will be able to trust you as a clinician and feel comfortable disclosing personal information and experiences of sexual trauma. So one of the first steps is, of course, building rapport and trust with the client, making sure they know that they're in a safe space, what they disclose is confidential, and what your intentions are as a clinician, making it apparent that you're really listening to their needs. I think it's also important to emphasize choice and their control in the session and treatment modalities that they feel comfortable using is really important. I would say avoid excessive, direct, or intrusive questions. We don't want to be re-traumatizing a client. And setting a really supportive tone is a great way to engage, and also really stressing a client's strengths and resilience. I know that this is a great tool, especially working with this population. When I was doing some research on some of the best treatment options for sexual trauma, a large majority of the literature have mentioned cognitive processing therapy, which is a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I just wanted us to watch a little video to see how it is used in practice.
CPT, cognitive processing therapy, it's one of the evidence-based treatments for PTSD. So what that means for you is that it has good sound science and research behind it that says this is an effective treatment for PTSD.
We look at what you're thinking, what you're telling yourself about the trauma, and we have you examine those thoughts through writing. It's a really logical therapy where we look at the evidence for why you've drawn the conclusions that you have about what happened to you. And a lot of times those thoughts are, it's my fault, or I should have done something differently. And it brings about these emotions of shame and guilt. And some of the conclusions that you've drawn may actually not be true. So in this therapy, we examine those conclusions, those thoughts that you have, and teach you how to organize your thinking through your writing so that you can step back and reflect on what actually transpired.
Now, this isn't a treatment that's going to say if you just think good thoughts, you're going to have good feelings. It's not exactly that. It looks at developing balanced ways of thinking that sometimes gets distorted or become obstacles to healing from PTSD.
All right, so when I was doing a little bit more research, I was actually watching some TikToks on people who have lived experiences using CPT for their trauma, and a lot of them had really good feedback. However, I do want to say though, some of them did express concern for the amount of homework that is involved, a lot of worksheets, and it is a challenging approach. So I do want to be mindful that it might be not the best for every single client, but it is a potential. The next one is acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a mindfulness-based therapy, which is also derived from behavioral therapy as well. And ACT and research has been deemed as an effective method in supporting adult sexual assault survivors suffering with PTSD symptoms. In one study I found, it reduced experiential avoidance, thought suppression, trauma symptomology, and increased quality of life among the 18 participants. And some of the techniques used were mindfulness techniques, grounding techniques, and visual metaphors. So I think that this is another great option. All right, so now for my personal recommendations, I kind of broke this up into two. Some of my recommendations as a clinician, and some as a society member. So first one is being an ally for women. And I would say just voicing your concerns about the well-being for women in our communities, attending rallies, voting for change are all great. But for an intervention while in the clinical role, I think maintaining a positive and consistent relationship with the client, so that they feel like they have a good working relationship with you, making sure they know you're taking them seriously, you're being compassionate, and really present with them, I think is a great approach while working from the trauma-informed lens. My next one is acts of resistance. And I think this can take place by amplifying women's voices who have experienced sexual trauma, highlighting when injustices occur, believing women when they say they have experiences of violence, I think is a great way to contribute to small acts of resistance. And for the clinical role, one thing I found interesting in the Principles of Trauma Therapy book is the way in which gender constructs have shaped the way women and men express feelings. Women being more prone to only discussing sadness and fear, while working from a trauma-informed lens, really communicating to the client in this population that any feeling is valid. And I think this is a great way to resist against sexist standards that have been placed upon women, especially in the therapeutic role. My next one is listening to the needs of others, practicing listening skills through active listening, and really letting the client be the expert of their experiences and dictating how they want their treatment to go. For this population, for evidence-based techniques, I would say recommending mindfulness-based stretching and breathing, because sometimes homework and worksheets, they may work, but they may not work for some. So having this as another option. I also think that some art-based therapy is a really good method for some PTSD survivors and those who have sexual trauma. Is a great way to work with these folks. And I do want to say that because access is such a constraint, giving techniques so that the person who may not want to come back to therapy, they have some techniques to take with them when they leave the session if they're not comfortable going back for another session. is really important. So really highlighting that these techniques can be done on their own terms is really important and gives them a sense of control, which I think is a really, really good and important method to working with this population. So yeah, those are my evidence-based techniques and some of my personal recommendations. And I thank you for listening to this presentation and hopefully learning more with me. So yeah, thank you.